Welcome to the My Rules Are Better podcast. I'm Tom Barbalet, and today I have the pleasure, once again, look, I'm in COVID time myself, but it seems like 9 months since we last spoke, Barney. I mean, in a recorded, to be aired fashion. It's been an inordinate length of time since we last chatted, right?
Well, I'm not going to contradict you, but I did just see it said 8 months ago, but you never know with these approximations. So 8-9 months, there's no need to split hairs. That's crazy.
It's kind of obscene, really. But we have had I'll use the term pleasure. You can pick whatever term you want to use. We have had the ability to play an extended game of Just Plain Chaos for, I guess, maybe 3 or 4 of those months.
Did it stretch out that long for that? Did we do 7 games in the end?
6 games in the end.
6 games in the end, and I missed 1.
Yeah, but 1 was extended, which I think kind of sniffed it into the additional month that I'm saying there. So maybe not a full month, but, 3 and a good bit months.
Yeah.
So,
go on.
I have a variety of topics here, in a variety of different directions, but you, out of all the players, I think you were doing a multi-level review of the experience, which I found fascinating. Most of the players just kind of showed up and, appreciated that dice would be rolled and things would happen and this kind of stuff. But you seem to have taken it on a variety of different... there was a kind of anthropological direction. There was definitely a heavy sociological direction. There was a deeper philosophy direction. There were a wide variety of Barney Dickers that turned up to various games and also narrated. Although you did stop at some stage and just declare that you would give no more narration to the Just Plain Chaos game in your particular podcast, Loco Ludus. So, in terms of your experience, should we cut it in the various forms? How would you like to approach this particular problem?
Okay. Well, firstly, I would say it's not a problem. It's not a problem. It's a problematic. Do we call it a problematic instead? I guess I don't always think about these escapades in those clearly defined brackets. So experientially, I'm just thinking, right? And it's bouncing in all of those different directions. So I suppose, I came to the game with all back history and that amazing insight that you gave me on my podcast on Loco Ludus about where the idea came from, which gave me the inspiration to adopt Australian accent. So then as another aspect of that is, I recalled that I said, Tom, you should play online more. And you were saying, I don't know.
In a perfect world, it would have happened. I mean, I'm it's so far removed from the perfect world in so many different ways. You were an instigator with regards to this in particular, which I don't know if I've explicitly narrated through the podcast, but let me air it here. You seem to have a lot of really great online gaming experiences, and mysteriously, some participants are never really invited to any of these things. So I thought, okay, the way to make this explicit is actually to invite Barney to one of these things and show him that I'm the kind of person that's easily excluded from various... I'm a bit instigatory. I'm a bit in your face for a certain group of people. And it often interests me when I'm contacted by friends, for example, that want to have some online forum associated with some piece of television or whatever. And I turn up and I'm there by myself. And then I realize, actually, they've created another group for everyone else. Tom's in one group. He's doing his thing. And then everyone else is in the other group. Although I have caused occasional fractions online. So I kind of feel that way associated with our... whatever's working towards this, our communicative relationship, that this may have actually been the case in this circumstance.
Okay, well, no, but you're not necessarily wrong. But no, I don't think, I wouldn't say that I've excluded you. So I'll come back to that, but I obviously the pandemic shifted a lot of things, and it has done for me in terms of the gaming as well. And I think it has been good online play, because I think you get to play with people who are really into it, and I probably said that before, and I think that is a real virtue. And the moment that I realised that I didn't have to use online dice rollers or buy into all of that stuff, I just felt like, well, it was as simple as our conversation now, basically. And in some ways, you did that. You also did a massive load of work for it with the maps and everything to work online. So that was really impressive. I think in terms of the games, and in getting you in there, it's very difficult juggling different groups of people. Time-wise as much as anything else. And one of the things that one of the things I've tried to do from playtests of my game, it hasn't always worked out that way, but one of the things I've wanted to do is play with little groups of people who know each other somehow, so that there's no getting to know people needed, so we can just get playing.
Do you think that was necessary? I mean, I've always found that to be completely and utterly artificial.
Yeah.
And certainly, the Just Plain Chaos setup was exactly in that light. My view is that people that have a shared interest in doing anything will oftentimes find kinship and discussion points. And I know specifically that Matt Gibson and Chris Abbott, because they live relatively close to one another, have actually, they're about 45 minutes drive apart. But I think, these kind of new connections, and certainly when I did it at work, I brought in a couple of people that I knew externally, or one person I knew externally specifically. And that was incredibly important for them and my co-workers as well to kind of meet and interact. So my view is that actually, I think these kind of things are really very artificial. I think the need for people to know each other prior and I think that's one of the beautiful things about the, online role-playing, what have you, scenarios is that actually the existential respect that comes from and we'll get into the YOLO playing abilities a little bit later, perhaps, in this discussion. But I think what interests me through this is not any kind of shared relationship. And I think a lot of that's really artificial as well. I mean, it could just be that I am constantly moving into groups where I, don't necessarily know everyone and concerned and just have to, adapt through that. But I think, I would certainly question that. And obviously the Just Plain Chaos game is part of that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You're not wrong there at all. I can't, and I think my experience of doing that with people, running a playtests with people who know each other, and when they haven't so much, it doesn't make so much difference. I guess, I don't know, just something. I just was wanting maybe that was my initial idea, something. But in terms of getting you into the game, I think there are also these questions of time frames, and I know you're busy, and I'm busy, and I know I'm busy, and you're busy.
People make time. I mean, I think the nature of these things. Indeed. I mean, I've taken the afternoon off work in part to have this conversation with you.
Yes.
So, I mean, my view is that particularly through the pandemic, because I find myself working more than I did prior to the pandemic, you need new rules and boundaries, and the work-life balance for me has completely gone out the window. So, I mean, I think it's important to make time in these circumstances. And the thing that fascinates me through actually, because a lot of the stuff that I described leading up to the Just Plain Chaos game, I think you've now actually explicitly experienced, which is something I wanted to talk a bit more about. You've talked a little bit about the planning, the plot, for want of a better point. I don't want to use the narrative word here, but the way that I put a lot of planning into kind of turning point plot construction, lots of information that was never actually touched upon, which I don't personally find frustrating, because I think a lot of this stuff is associated with kind of, when you experience a broth within a soup where the bones have been boiled for, many hours prior, you get the sense that there's a lot more, and that's a feeling that I like to give in games. A sense that this environment is broader than just the individual, and certainly it's more for the individual to pick up information than it is for everything to be, like an introductory, play yourself D&D book where you're just reading through and after about 5 to 7 read-throughs, you will have encountered most of the meat in the scenario. I like to try to create something which seems to be almost sublime. I mean, I think sublime is the emotion I'm looking for with regards to just how deep the universe is. We might talk a little bit about the sea lion thing that I'm working on currently, which I find very similar in a very fascinating way, except it's based almost exclusively on historic documents, and these kind of things. So anyway, so as a player, let's remove the all the sociological, psychological, anthropological stuff.
Okay.
How does the Just Plain Cast game rate compared to, other games that you've played online in recent times and maybe even, in broader times?
Okay. How does it compare? So the most obvious thing that springs up to me is, being a theory kind of guy, being a game designer, I love the rules. And that's not because I want to muscle in on the game master's realm or anything like that. I just somehow want to know how it goes. And I kept on to you about this, didn't I? When can I see the resolution mechanics?
Well, that's what I find kind of curious, because the rules, aside from small elements of the resolution mechanics, were all available prior to the game. So when you created the character, you had basically the player's handbook worth of rules. The resolution mechanics is really half a paragraph in addition to that. And I think we resolved that pretty well within the first couple of games. But then what was interesting was that you had broader kind of meta questions, and certainly leading into this discussion today, you wanted to know about the role of dice and groups and whether I was rolling for individuals. And what I moved to, actually, because I realized that certain people were reacting to every time I rolled the dice, was I have 2 layers of foam matting, which I put down, and I made sure that I wasn't rolling the dice in front of the camera, just to not give the sense of impeding doom, which basically seemed to be coming anyway. So I changed that within the last 2 games, and I think your pretty immediate reaction was, have you stopped rolling dice? What's gone on with the dice? Where are the dice here? What's going on with this dice? So, I certainly feel that from your kind of perspective as a player.
You need to patent some silent dice. That's what you need to patent.
Foam dice.
I felt, I don't know what it was. I felt like there was something. I didn't care. In a way, I didn't care because I was looking forward to the games and that was all fine. But I felt like, how is this thing going to work? And when I did ask and you did explain, and we've had other exchanges about it, somehow it's taken me ages to just realize, the rules, the mechanics are incredibly, incredibly simple. They're so simple that they're kind of blink and you miss it, which is not to say that there wasn't mechanical depth or machination or, game happening. It was just, they were so simple that I was on the lookout for something more complicated. That's what I've realized it was that I was doing. And you probably told me over and over again. And that's really interesting, because then that flips the game towards the scenarios, the adventures, the world, the setting. And so I don't, so as a player, I don't know if my tendency would be towards more mechanics, a bit more mechanics. And that's where I had this feeling that there was some mechanic that you were, the dice rolling that you were doing, that I wasn't privy to, that we, the players, weren't privy to. So I was wondering, what's he doing? What's he not doing?
It's an interesting kind of juxtaposition, because I think the explicit nature of rules, I basically, when I did 5th edition D&D, I played it pretty similar. I think the background rolling is more me playing games with myself. So, for example, there are various scenarios where I think, what's the probability of this happening? What's the probability of this happening? Oh, what's the probability of this happening? And then I construct that mathematically while, other things are going on. And then I roll based on that, which changes elements of the scenarios. The balance between dice rolling and plot, I think, is very interesting here. And certainly there were typically each scenario, there were at least between 12 to 24 plot points that, and usually the worst case scenario, I think you hit 5 of them when I had 20 plus of them. It was one of these situations where there are 2 kind of layers. There's the first lower level probabilistic layer. And within that, which is something that you raised, which I wanted to talk about, sometimes these probabilities are based on individuals or groups. Sometimes these things switch between groups to individuals to groups to, and the way in which I do that is I also play D&D that way. I think it's independent of the rule system. I think it's a way that you can construct a universe and play it accordingly. And compared to perhaps a slightly more mechanical or novice perspective associated with how these games are played, it's something, and you mentioned that you played RuneQuest recently. I wanted to touch on that briefly. But RuneQuest, Matthew Gibson, being 11 in this world, like 11 years old in this world, in parallel having almost mythological connections with various mathematical ideas, all these things came together. So what you see here is a representation now 34 years on, 33 years on from that. But it gives me an ability to reproduce a style of gameplay which I saw in part through Matthew Gibson, which was really part of the beauty of playing this game, because I don't think Matthew Gibson's played as a player for many years. So he was in an interesting position, but he also, I think, could see elements, and I really need to talk to him about this, of his own historical gameplay style, because I learned so much. But we're probably talking about 6 hours of my life. Well, in terms of the actual conversation, probably about 9 hours of my life, but 6 hours of actually observing and participating in gameplay. And that just completely blew my mind. And at the same time, I was already interested in at the time, which is the early 90s, I guess, late 80s, there was this notion of freeform role-playing, which is role-playing without any rules. So in that environment, it really is just storytelling plus occasionally.
Yes.
So coming to it with this notion that everything should be kind of additive, nothing should take away from your experience of it. The rules are there to be interpreted, and also, which didn't happen with this game, but certainly happened with the D&D game at work, occasionally we came to points of rules interpretation, which I always found really interesting, because it's a maturity of a rule system, but also a maturity of the game players that are participating in this. And, asking people how they think rules should operate, what they represent, does it map to the real world, is it even tangible in a kind of real world discussion, I think is really fascinating as well. Not so many, ironically, when we played Chaos at work, we had a couple of those points, but it was mainly associated with shootouts, which we strangely didn't have a lot of in this game. But that was in large part due to the way the players chose to play it as well, I think. Anyway.
Well, you kept taking our weapons off us.
You kept putting yourselves in positions where your weapons got taken away. The easiest way to hold on to a weapon is to use it, right? Not using a weapon is a great way to lose a weapon, right? So anyway.
How many times did the entire team lose all of their weapons?
How many times did the entire team completely pay everything passive? Like, oh yeah, we're just walking into this situation. We've got guns on us, but no, let's not prepare ourselves in any way for the fact that these things need to be used. I think what was fascinating through this was just, historically, when I've, in the past, 4 years, there's always been at least one player who's just played it what I call YOLO, you only live once, which means literally they play their character like the character has a death wish, and they're just going to take this to an extreme. And what's interesting here is I had hopes here that maybe one of you would take that role. And to a certain extent, you were responsible for the mattress, right?
Yeah.
So I think you could have played it that way. And particularly, the spoiler alert associated with the game is Barney emailed me, I think, just before the last game or second last game. We were having some nuances. And he said, I want to be killed. What was it that you wanted to be completely killed in a horrible means? And this was going to be your answer from the game or something.
Oh yeah, no, you could just slaughter me doing just trying to do something, just support. I don't know, support the cause. Go out and just get wiped out.
Were you pleased with that resolution where basically every player had to question your motives in a very confrontational fashion?
Was I happy with it? It was totally fine. It was totally fine, and it worked. It worked as an ending really nicely. I mean, it wasn't much. There wasn't much game. I just died.
So you didn't plead your case particularly. Again, you didn't plead your case particularly strongly in certain circumstances.
No. But see. I would say that I was playing You Only Live Once. I was basically just going for it. I wasn't going to try and tell them that they shouldn't, or. I did try and tell them that I had friends in higher places and that they wouldn't be the end of it.
You had potential to turn on another player, though, in this circumstance, which I thought there were a couple of players that you could have turned on, and you were just like, no, It's fine. I'm just going to be the one that gets killed. That's the way it's going to happen. So, yeah.
Well, that exposes, all sorts of interesting things. So, I mean, I guess I might have played it a bit more wild and reckless, but I felt like, I don't know, I felt like that wouldn't necessarily go fit with the group, I think. And I think on the one hand, whilst I want to be completely wild and reckless and just blow up everything, I'm also respectful of the fact that that other people are entitled to be their way. So, I mean, within the world, if you like, my character didn't really have any gripes with any of the rest of the team. So I wouldn't have turned on other members of the group, if you see what I mean. Yeah, would we have a bit more gung ho about it? I think when we started the game, I think we all felt quite civilized. We felt like civilized people. Of course, within the elite, who have some vague idea of how privileged they are, and that we're subject to. We're under attack. We were under attack from insurgents. So that immediately set up this kind of civilized idea. We're trying to get across town in a civilized way in a firefight, which of course led to some very sub-civilized actions. But I don't think we got into the groove of being really gung-ho about it, because none of us really were. Me and, Jason and I had previously had a novelty hunting business. So that was always kind of waiting in the wings. And, Jason and I, had 2 mattresses. We had a mattress each at one point. So we did give it a go. But I don't, we were just, doing stag parties and stuff like that. We weren't extremist weapon carriers with the political axe to grind about our liberty or anything like that. So none of us wanted to take on the revolutionaries, did we? The insurgents.
Well, that's interesting, because certainly the backstory was varied between the characters, which is not something you saw. I mean, you saw that I presented you with a story, but I also presented everyone else with stories. And certainly a couple of players, I mean, Matthew in particular, wanted to be very sympathetic with the the rebels. And I think you, to a certain extent, had some discussion of that. In fact, I think multiple characters approached me out of the game and said, we are probably slightly more sympathetic to the rebels than everyone else, which I thought in of itself was quite telling. But the playing, I mean, I think it's interesting. The people that I've experienced who have been really strong YOLO players, and they haven't always done it uniformly. It's not like they just sometimes find this character and they're like, within this character, I can, take on the world and do a whole series of really stupid and reckless things. And I think perhaps the framing that none of you were in that light was part of it. But I think certainly, I mean, and this probably is for the conversation with Matthew as well. Once you take on a sense that you're slightly sympathetic to the force that is coming en masse to take over, how do you actually play that? Like, what subtlety? And in the case of Matthew, there were a couple of kind of text messages he sent me and these kind of things, which didn't work out particularly well because I didn't have my phone close by in one of the cases. But what I hoped for was actually to bring in more, unfortunately times just didn't allow for it, but bring in more of the kind of YOLO players somewhere through the scenario. Sean, for example, who was supposed to be playing, I think would have taken a very studied line to how he could play. And rather than being a reckless YOLO player, I think he would have played it just at points of sabotage and things like that, potentially. So, I mean, I think the dynamics, it could have been many things, but what interested me actually at the end was we did go through, in large part which you led, a kind of deconstruction of the way the game had been played, because I was very interested in that. And also, like, why, I mean, the phenomenon of losing weapons, I think, I don't know. In parallel to a lot of this stuff, I've been, watching the rise of fast online games. I only see them through YouTube. I've tried to play a couple of them, but it never ends well. And through that, you have really strong kind of YOLO narrative players that behave in very strange situations. It's interesting seeing, in parallel to doing this, like within one's brain, so to speak, what's happening with these kind of online games that are doing it as well. Because you do see very interesting play styles where I don't know, because of the immediacy, perhaps the visual imagery, a variety of different factors, I think within an online game, people are probably more likely, or maybe just the online game players are more likely to play, not so clinging on to dear life kind of characters, but more. And I think that was what interested me in this game, was that if perhaps it had been a computer game, where you could literally see yourself picking up the guns and holding the guns, and these kind of things, if it would have been played differently, if the psychologies of the various players would have been like, I have a gun now, like I physically see this character with a gun. Now instead of, let's just get initiated by putting our weapons down and doing this other stuff, why don't we use the guns in this game? So, I think and maybe that is I'm always thinking, like, what could I have done as the whatever games mechanic master, what have you, to change this thing? And maybe instilling more holding of a firearm or these kind of things, maybe that was an element. I don't really know, because I think a lot of it is down to player choice, right? And you don't want to eliminate that.
What you're talking about there, I wonder if that comes back to the old topic, one of our old topics, of the war game role play opposition. Because if we had been playing, for example, just playing Chaos the Skirmish
with miniatures
game,
we
would have been, I think, or even just with kind of online tokens, moving around as maps, it would immediately, I think, switch it into that combat mode where there's very little role play, if you like. It's very mechanical. It's very tactical, strategic, whatever. And there's none of that qualitative, or there's less of that qualitative discussion, negotiation going on. So, so I wonder if the video games I don't know, because I don't play them, but I wonder if they seem like they would be role play games, but really they're first person war games.
So the visualization element is one that I find, is it maybe with cards, for example? So you have your possessions as cards in front of you that you can see. Maybe there are elements that you can learn in part from the kind of video game environment. But to be continued. I think with the stuff that you're doing, you're moving very heavily into like visual. There's a substantial visual component to the stuff that you're doing. And I think that's, we'll talk about that in another podcast, but maybe that is a way to actually address some of these issues, is to just make certain parts of the game element more visual.
Yeah, I was thinking about this topic of where it leads in, from mechanics to play styles, including the game master style and the player's styles. And some of the feedback, that I had got on a game was about that was initially posed to me as being a mechanical question or point that was raised, and it quickly became clear that really it was about play style, and it wasn't really a criticism or anything like that. And interestingly, I think it was one of those, I like this, but other people might not. And then you get into this really interesting zone where people are not actually saying, well, then they are saying what they like, but they're imagining that other people don't like it. But it's all very good, all very constructive. And so the point was, something that might seem that it's mechanical actually might be about play style or presentation style or something like that. And that's really fascinating, because it's all about this readability on these different levels. And so with your dice rolling, I felt like I couldn't read it. You were this kind of black box in that way. And on the one hand, I like that. And on the other hand, I don't. And I suppose when I game master, and with some of the other games that I play, the premise is often to be pretty transparent with things. There'll be one or two things that would be obscured. Now, I've played in other games as well, other than yours, where game master roles are very secret, very secretive. And in a way, both ways are equal. Me personally, I kind of want to know, I want to see the random generation of events.
Could that be because you feel yourself more in the games master space than the player space in a lot of this? I mean, I think what's interesting, certainly in our experience with just playing Chaos, is that I realized that you, through just necessity, through how you are, you need to, and maybe, I mean, I don't know if you'd ever see yourself playing as a kind of GM role in a just playing Chaos game, a controller role in a just playing Chaos game. But I found it fascinating that you did have these kind of more games master concerns. And what interests me, I think, the nature of dice rolling just as a thing, which is independent of games, I think, just the way in which you construct universes, the way in which you construct probability in universes, maybe prior to games, you roll a bunch of dice and create a deterministic, universe which doesn't require any dice rolls through the game itself. But, I mean, you must, when you are in a games master position, I mean, do you narrate to the players, and now I'm going to roll these dice, and if these rolls happen, then this will happen, if these rolls happen, then this will happen? How do you construct transparency if you're rolling dice in a games master role?
I suppose that depends. It depends on the moment, like you say that you construct the probabilities on the fly. I guess those moments also come on the fly where you might, if it's quite pivotal, you might say, okay, if it's this to this, it's going to go badly. If it's this to this, it's going to go in your favor, or so, something.
Do you narrate that
like
to the player?
I might do. Yeah, for sure. The other thing would be, a good old random table. I mean, you don't necessarily have to go through the whole random table. I think it's about this feeling of, which I like as a player and as a GM, this feeling of, okay, none of us know exactly what's round this corner. Let's find out. And I think just having that, and I think were doing that in some ways a lot of the time as well. So I guess my feeling is why not just have that more open? But
the scope of possibilities presented to the player oftentimes will give them response changes, for want of a better term. And I think that scope of possibilities is something that could potentially overwhelm certain players, could potentially create responses from players which are artificially created around that. I mean, I think there is a fine line between transparency and creating a world, right? Sure. I like the idea in part of pre-rolling everything and then just having a series of kind of crossed out tables, markers, ticks, what have you, and then seeing how the players go through that. But I think some of that doesn't allow for player interaction and perturbation of the universe.
Totally.
Which I think is incredibly important.
I was listening to someone talking about on another podcast, and my brain's just gone completely blank. And they're kind of talking about how it's my friend Andy Goodman on Expedition to the Grizzly Peaks, and he's talking about running Masks of Nyarlathotep for Call of Cthulhu, and he talked about how you can have this plan, but as soon as you introduce players into it, like as a Heisenberg principle, it goes in another direction. And that's, of course, absolutely. Now, I think I've said this to you before, but for me, I think the heart of role-playing, and I think in my interpretation of your experience, those 6 hours playing with Matthew, my belief in the power of role-play is in the movement between the game world and the play world. Is that how?
No, I understand what you mean perfectly. For me, if I can just reinforce that point, for me, playing with Matthew created a richer, but also I probably hadn't actually been a player in a game like that from maybe even at age 11, probably 3 or 4 years, because it was the role that I took as the games master, even from a young age. But the ability, the richness of the environment, the mystical nature of how Matthew had constructed magic, for example, a series of different things, which I found absolutely fascinating in the RuneQuest environment, created what you described as a richness of experience, which not only impacted me in terms of the game, but also impacted my thinking associated with how games should be played going forward. And I think that is probably the strongest way that I can reinforce what you were saying, that this wasn't just I'm playing a game experience. This is I understand universe building as a thing, and I understand, and Matthew's particular perspective on this thing spun me in a different direction associated with how I did it in the future.
And so I think for everyone involved, that movement, that shuttling is the word I tend to use, between, if you like, the rules and the systems and the fictions, that's where the power, that's where the animation is that kind of, I'm doing something, and that translates as dice or stats or something, or how can I use the stats to move the fiction forward, and how does the fiction move the stats forward, like progression system or probabilities, all of those kinds of things. So it's this kind of, it's as if you've got one eye on the fiction and one eye on the system. And so for me, I just love negotiating both of those realms. And that's where I'd come back to answer your question, that yes, probably playing it as a player in your game, my motives were probably on the side of game design, being involved in it myself, and often game mastering myself. But at no point did I want to take over from what you were doing. But I come back to your point that you made when I had you on my podcast, where you talk about the game master perturbing the players. And I think the opposite is also true, that players need to perturb the game master. But that's it's not a negative conflict. It's always a positive conflict. So if I seem like I'm playing in the game master mode, that might partly be true. It's also circumstantially true, but it's also just digging into that potential of play and moving between those different worlds and that productive antagonism that you get.
There's a gestalt here, which I think I just want to reinforce. It is not just rules plus, environment. The thing that I got out of rules plus environment plus Matthew Gibson is something that I learned from, that the gestalt of the intelligence, creativity, unpredictability, irascibility in some cases of the games master creates an experience which is far more, and this I think is the difficulty in it being communicated. I mean, obviously you listen to a lot more of the podcasts in the space than I do, but I think the gestalt from this is what I really learned from in Matthew's case, and it spun me, like I said, in a different direction. But also it made me feel that of the experiences that I convey to people, my role as a games master historically, like when I was a child, was always incredibly important. When I returned to this, thanks in large part to Derek Stutzman, who you've now met on a few occasions, I realized that I had to bring that element back. I had to bring that gestalt back. And that's something that I really find fascinating, that some of it can be described, some of it has to actually be enacted. But thinking about it more, it is associated with a very particular kind of, not necessarily polymath discipline, but it touches on so many different aspects. And I think this is something that fascinated me seeing it in Matthew's presentation, and something which I've tried to take away from that experience and represent that in some small manner, basically in the games that I've, run, for want of a better term.
Well, I mean, but presumably as well, that factored into even the mechanics of Just Plain Chaos or any other game.
You mean the lessering of the mechanics, or the way in which the mechanics were not as... I think there are choices about mechanics.
You want, yeah, exactly. Because you want to facilitate for yourself and for other people directly, and then other people indirectly, to have a certain type of experience, and not to have to reinvent the wheel or, have anything too overwhelming, and at the same time to have all of the possibilities for depth and exploration that they might want. And as we've talked about, and as you talk about, and we all talk about, some games seem to encourage that freedom more than others, or some seem to be about locking stuff down, and others seem to be about opening up.
There's always a choice associated with that. I mean, you've experienced 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. You had a particularly visceral reaction to that experience. I put to you that maybe the way I play it is distinctly different, perhaps, than the way that you experienced it. And certainly we had, and some of the YOLO players were these players, we had players that came with the rules, having read the rules, having looked to exploit the rules, and within maybe 2 or 3 games, they started to realize, Tom's not really playing it like that. There's as returning to the gestalt, there's something more here than just the rules. We've got to start exploring this. And it was interesting, actually, when they specifically called rules on me, they said, the rule says this. And I said, I'm doing it like this. And that's not, they're not incompatible. I am just interpreting the rule with this interpretation, and you have taken it with this interpretation. I think, in part, I'm sure you studied philosophy at some level in your various, wanderings. My perspective is that, when I studied philosophy academically, I realized that the whole nature of interpretation is something which is beautifully presented with what you would think were even the most buttoned down rules. There is still a certain amount of give, even within those rules. So,
well, it occurs to me that the field, the discipline of interpretation, by definition, has to remain unfinished or unbounded or always open. Otherwise, it's not interpretation. It'd be called something like definition. And I mean, taxonomy, I think, is a great thing. I love it because you can have all this fun with it. You can, on the one hand, you're making lists and categorizing things, but you can just come up with another one that, I don't know, configures things in a completely different way. So even when you think you've got a kind of a principle of stability or order, it's just a framework to do whatever the hell you like with, right?
I have a fascinating example from my own life. Maybe not fascinating, but it's an example nonetheless. As a boy, I studied electronics, as you do, as some boys do. Relays, circuitry, resistors, capacitors, all this kind of stuff. My grandfather was a desert rat. He survived North Africa, up through Sicily, up through Europe, and basically drove trucks for the army through that period, most of it. He had different rules for electronics than I did. So we had circuitry and diagrams where he would say, this won't work. And I'd say, demonstrably, I can show you this working. And then he'd say, this won't work because of this. And then I showed him the circuit working. And then we kind of dived into different areas. But the nature of that made me realize very strongly that the solidity, the rigidity that people use with regards to, logic, naming conventions, all these kind of things, can still, through someone who is in part self-taught, in part, both my grandfather and I were self-taught in different areas, right? But it was fascinating coming to terms with, and he was considerably more hostile than I was about this, but it was fascinating just to see that people can construct their lives with completely different logic rules, still live quite although I'm a work in progress, I might not, but still live quite comfortably to the end of one's life with completely different principles, which still enable you to deal with the world in a very productive and reasonable fashion.
Yeah.
And I think that is one of the counterbalances to my life that I've always returned to. That, and it's a great way of actually understanding living in different parts of the world as well. Like how people live so differently. Anyway. So I think that's basically what is on offer here. I wanted to perhaps conclude the Just Plain Chaos discussion for now. Any final thoughts, any final points of feedback, anything that you wanted to just leave?
Okay. So I really enjoyed the character creation process. So I wonder if, as you put all of this together, if there could be a random table of different professional backgrounds or life backgrounds or whatever you want to call them, so that you could roll on that, so that you have this spark of a person, and then from that, I wanted to, on the one hand, optimize my point buy, which fascinated me as well. It took me a moment, like with the opposite sides of the dice and all of that, and I was going, and then I thought, that's really nice. I really like it, and it creates an evenness without exactly, but without ironing out differences. So. Yes. Really nice. So there was all of that, and so I had my points to spend, and I really wanted to spend them the most efficiently. But I also wanted to put flesh on the bones of this character.
So
that
my
you had
perspective
given me.
is that this would be an optional thing. I think for certainly a majority of the people that I play with, they don't want to do that. But for you, I think I can add it as an optional thing.
I think it's great, because even if I imagine myself to GM it, say, right, okay, I'm going to give people 5 players, 5 character backgrounds, ding, 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 ding. And they're not me deciding who it's going to be. It's this array of alternative near future, whatever we want to call it, back or characters. And then, but beyond that, it was nothing. There were no modifiers or special languages or anything like that. It was simply, here's where this person's come from. Do what you want to do with it. Construct that how you like. So I really, really enjoyed that. And yeah, that kind of put me what I thought it put, I felt like it put me in the world. And then of course you knocked us out from the word go. So that all took other directions, which was also really good and fine and nice. I thought the group was really nice. I really enjoyed the whole Pulitzer. It was, sometimes the Pulitzer idea was a joke, and then at other times it seemed to
a defining factor.
It seemed to give a little bit of something, a little bit of motivation. I think I said this in the discussion afterwards. I think you did a great job of giving us a sense of scale, size, time, and at the same time it was a very bounded scenario. It was very clear that we weren't really getting out of the city. And that was a really interesting glimpse into this world that you've grown out of those real life experiences. So that was, having had our discussions and then playing in the game, that just felt really nice and really good. I suppose the games now you're not on Discord, are you?
I've tried Discord a few times.
Yeah.
And I've created small communities which have been perturbed in some case, but then just drop off. I think the Discord is a lot like Twitter. You need to, it's very well designed for people that have, 3 to 6 hours of time per day that they can be somewhere casually, right?
No. You see, so I'm in there basically very rarely, very minimally.
No, I'm talking about maintenance. I'm not talking about as an individual.
Oh.
I'm talking about if you're creating a Discord community, you need at least a couple of people that are going to be there passively for a good portion of the time.
But I also use it to message certain people. It becomes a message platform. It's funny how you message different people on different platforms. I find in life, but it's really interesting to see the little communities where the if you like, the consumers, it's the wrong word for it, but the people who aren't the creators of the games. But it's interesting to see which ones that community really starts to create stuff, and that could be random tables or illustrations or maps, or even just asking creators, clarifying a rule or coming up with a house rule or something where they feel they can do that. And so I think that giving people who invest in it as much in terms of time and creativity as money, giving them the feeling that they can add something, I think seems to be a really important thing within the kind of indie communities. And of course that would spill out into open license, stuff as well. But so my kind of thought or question is to you, Tom, is you've created this amazing world, and I think it would be really worth making sure that there are opportunities and ways that people can dig in and generate their own.
Certainly. I think
elements, their own elements.
Discord, to me, as someone who's created communities previously, has required and I don't know your Discord experience, but if you logged onto a Discord server where, even if you're doing it periodically just to ping and what have you, it needs to have some life to it. I created what is it now? Maybe 8 years ago, I created a forum for simulation, particular kinds of simulation, biological simulation. And I had it online for maybe 2 years, and that gave me a lot of interesting, learning deltas associated with how active a forum needs to be in order for it to reach that self-productivity level. Discord is similar because you need to have just a group of people that are going to be there on the order of once a day, just to ping people, just to create a community there. So that requires, usually, for me, it would require me to be on that, community for more time, unfortunately, than I have currently. Otherwise, I would need to find people that were willing to be on there. Now, sometimes organically, and I've not done Kickstarter, but sometimes organically through things like Kickstarter, certainly through certain times of my open source project, IRC channels, which is basically the older, grayer, grandfather of Discord. I had maintenance people on there sufficient to maintain these things, but it does, infrastructurally, it requires a community of, it could just be 10 people, but that is willing to check in on a daily basis and give the perception that, it's at least an active community.
Well, I wasn't necessarily saying rush to Discord, go to Discord, that's the way. It was more that my feeling is, and this is as much in my thinking about my projects, that people can more readily get into the thing that you're offering if there's some way that they are offering something in it. So, and that comes back to the kind of the organicity element of these things. So I think for people to get into this world that you've created, which has all of this, all this fascinating stuff, and people should really go back and listen to that interview, on those interviews on my podcast, I think, for that insight of that background of where the ideas came to you, or those experiences. Really fascinating, all that sociological stuff going on. I guess I was just thinking, for people to get in and explore that, there need to be these ways for them to feel they can get in and create their own little cultures, if you like, as in funguses or
Certainly.
whatever they would be. That kind of.
We talked a little bit about the scenario book, which I think is the next thing that It's interesting because the Sea Lion project has kind of come out of that. I did want to talk a little bit about the Sea Lion project before we wrap things up. But the scenario book very much was an idea of 12 different scenarios in this world with the view that the rules are relatively thin. So that could be like, the first ultra thin chapter, and then you get into the detail and depth, basically, of the various scenarios. So that was my thinking, was that the scenario book was going to be that vehicle to explore to the nth degree, not just what you guys have completed in Vista Park, but also a variety of different scenarios. Now, this Sea Line project, which originally was just to play, or created just playing Chaos setting in London in 1940 with a German invasion, has become something that's a bit more computer simulation, a bit more, vast map analysis, and it's now getting, fringe academic interest, which is always fun. So, I think what's interesting through this is through the scenario booklet, through exploring the scenario booklet, I've actually kind of stumbled upon something which has been played out in terms of various popular and academic writing, but has never been played out in large-scale simulation. The games that are available around Sea Line are pretty precursory. They're not to the level of depth that I'm, working on. So I think that is a project you want to have. One of the benefits I had with my early simulation work was I had astronomers, philosophers, astrophysicists, biologists, a variety of different people in an academic sphere that all immediately said, oh yeah, we've been looking for this forever. Like, let's get this tool together and let's, prod and promote and, make it something, which, seems to have a lot of really curious intellectual buy-in, which made that project very easy for me to spend 23, 24. In fact, a lot of Sea Line is based on that underlying project. So I think what interests me is potentially the scenario book with the rules as an addendum. The scenario book with the rules as an addendum. Putting that out there, be it Kickstarter or whatever, and then creating a community around that makes a lot of sense to me. All these things require a lot of work on my part. I've admired a number of the folks that you've, been able to interview and talk with and, befriend and what have you, because they find the perfect tipping point, obviously a good amount of work, but just not like a mind-blowingly ridiculous amount of work. So finding that tipping point, unfortunately, is a little late with regards to the scenario book, unless I produce, 4 scenarios plus a rules addendum, which is the possibility as well. I think currently on a kind of personal level, this whole situation with regards to kind of extended lockdown and a wide variety of other things has just completely spun me in terms of how I look at projects more than anything. Sea Line works for me because I can work on it in the evening, up in 3 hours a night and still feel like I'm not particularly productive. Writing, you write and you write and you write and you write and you write, and then you edit and you edit and you edit, and you're back to where you started with, and you write and write and write. So you've got this kind of, 2 steps forwards, 5 steps backwards, kind of situation with writing. But it's interesting. I think something in the next year, I think the Sea Line stuff, just because of the caliber of the people that have gotten in contact with me and the general level of interest, and also the immediate sense of a group of people that there's a need for this thing, is slightly different than just playing Chaos as a thing as well. So it'll all come together. But yeah, I do see Discord as being part of it. I just need a group of users. I'm very sensitive to kind of critical size, particularly with the open source projects I've worked on historically. I know when something has reached a critical size for a Discord channel, because I know I'll have at least 3 users that will be online for at least 6 hours a day and willing to at least passively participate in discussions, right? But without that, you end up with this kind of calling into an echo chamber kind of situation, which has happened with a number of the Discord channels I've set up historically. And then you go back and, I remember to log in a month's time, which is the worst possible case scenario. And, it's all completely died. It's like, I don't know, an ant farm that hasn't been fed or what have you. But
Tom, I suppose, these, any deadlines that you or I, in a way, set ourselves are completely arbitrary.
Yeah.
Aren't they? So the things will be ready, if you like, when they're ready. But I think that, the players that, I really enjoyed playing with all those other guys. We had a really good time, and that in itself was a thing. And you've got more coming through, and I think just keeping that going is feel, if that's got to be the right thing, hasn't it? And if something else kind of spins off from that if you like capitalizes on the clarity, the hard-won clarity, and can just hit the ground running and is done very fast, or has a different rapport with different people, then, if that surprisingly is the direction, the next destination, then, it's fine. And when you say just plain chaos with the C line, you mean the half page of rules, don't you? You mean using the rule system to take it to a different setting, and is that right?
So there are two parts. Well, actually, in my notes at least, there are 4 parts to this. But let's say there are 2 parts.
Okay.
So Sea Line, I think, is a really poorly. I've read a bit of the academic literature and a bit of the popular literature associated with it, and it's based on a single document that University of Oxford has. When you actually look at the broader scattered pieces of documentation that were found after 1945, you start to realize that this was going to be considerably more like Barbarossa than it was going to be like a Sunday picnic. The documentation that was found at the end of 1945 indicates there's about 140,000, 60,000 airborne, 80,000 coming by sea. It's like, let's just explore what happens when we land in England, kind of thing. And this creates a very different perspective compared to some of what's coming through with the academic work. So anyway, take that aside. For me, I had an existing set of books which I just own because that's just the kind of person I am. Proclivity-wise, I find histories and, put them in my shelves, particularly when they're original, so much the better. But really, the original documentation I'm finding absolutely fascinating. The levels between what the government supplied to people and what commercial outfits supplied to people through this period is just fascinating. The nature that there was like an official, you are the Home Guard versus a pocketbook to learning how to become the Home Guard, all the different training, which is anyway. So lots of different fascinating things from a simulation perspective. The maps I just absolutely love. The Ordnance Survey maps of the time. They have a color, they have a texture, they certainly have a smell. And doing that in computer simulation, I think just adds something amazing to it. But having said that, when you have them simulated, you also have the ability to have a really rich map book that you can present to players that has not only, the nuances with regards to the coastline and surveying, but also every single town. Every single town becomes a scenario, right? Every single town has its own, and they do. So there's the Dad's Army, let's say the element that's in the room here. There's the Dad's Army phenomena, which in the 80s and 90s produced a wide variety of really unreadable histories of recollections of people that had some connection to the Home Guard. I have a southeast of England Home Guard directory, which I think there's probably only 40 of these still in paper circulation. So I literally have the list of names and they're dotted addresses, but it's pretty easy to work out where they are, of every single person that was officially represented in the Home Guard in the southeast of England, which is a fascinating document, absolutely fascinating, because it shows both the formality and the informality of a lot of this. Literally just people meeting at scout halls and things like that. But it gives you a really strong sense of how curiously organic and untrained by the military a lot of this was. So, there's lots of really the other thing that I'm finding fascinating is you just pick any 2 or 3 little villages in the southeast of England, and they will all have World War II history that is not documented anywhere. You need to look back to structures that are damaged, this kind of nuances. The nature of the kind of damage that came through the Second World War is not very well, even if you go to individual, towns, contact archivists and what have you. It's more collecting an oral history of, the Catholic Church then became a school because it was damaged in the Second World War. How was it damaged in the Second World War? There's nothing written about how it was damaged. So you've got all this kind of lost memory element to it as well, which in simulation just provides so much possibility. For me currently, and it's such a different thing to be studying in depth in the new normal as well. It's one of these, through periods, the Pletniks medals early on, studying curious aspects of Napoleonic history. I now have a full translation of the Pletniks, biography that I've been through a couple of times. So it's finding these things to fixate on through the new normal. And Sea Lion, once I have these bits together, it means creating a just Playhouse role-playing setting through Sea Lion would just become like, it makes Middle-earth look like a sandcastle, right? So you have just this beautiful, rich texture of an environment that is very real, but also the notion of mythology I find fascinating, particularly with Napoleonic history, is basically there's a mythology to it now. It's outside the realms of time, of certain things where the documentation, and sadly and curiously, the Second World War is moving into that. Obviously, the First World War has taken in some of that too, but the Second World War is vastly moving into that now, particularly associated with just, loss of collective memory. So this is where it gets very interesting, associated with, if you create well-documented mythology associated with things, it still, captures an element of the time, which I think is, anyway. So that's what's captivated me with Sea Lion.
So is that, am I right in thinking that's going to be more an online simulation than it will be a role-play game, or are you thinking it's going to be all the stuff?
As I'm saying, let me say it again, perhaps in different words. To create a simulated environment sufficient to simulate this thing with primary source maps, you end up with amazingly high-resolution, high-detailed maps, which you can then crop into map books, right? This doesn't have to exist just in a computer. You can visually, and moreover, so there's this notion of vectorization, which is where you take, lines on a page and you make them collections of points, linking things up. So the buildings become collections of points. Roads become collections of points. Railways become collections of points. Rivers, sea, what have you. And through that, you can then create much higher resolution maps that explain things. The Ordnance Survey maps, the resolution is about to a pixel, because I have them digitally, is about 4 meters a pixel. So that gives us a good space where you can make out structures and what have you, but it still doesn't give an underlying, level of detail. Once you do this through simulation, you get a lot of that internal stuff. And then thankfully, I have a background in taking external structures and doing what-if scenarios, what the internal structure looks like based on that. I have existing simulation software that does that. So this is the kind of collection of bringing things together. Like, I have all these bits of simulation software historically that did these things. Then I have this particular application, and let's use these two things together. So I think it can easily be both. The computer simulation part up front gives you the level of detail that makes, Middle-earth seem like a sandcastle. You get the ability then to explore. And in particular, there are certain towns that have Sea Lion mythology associated with them because they were specifically called out in the German documents associated with where, the next hop would be before they got to London. So you've got, Ashford, for example, which is an interesting town. Don't get me wrong. But there are tens of towns like Ashford, many of which did have Second World War damage, either through bombing or other means. And there are many other possibilities. So rather than having a kind of linear progression of this is what everyone thinks Sea Lion's going to be like, suppose Ashford put on a better defence. Suppose the Home Guard in Ashford did too well, and they had to move to another town. Well, what's the Home Guard like there? What are the structures? Then you get to London. And London, just by football clubs alone, every area has its own different intrinsic means of setting up defences. I have a London historian who's very excited about this part of it. So the nature is that the different regions in London, which are now embodied in things like football clubs, all would have different means of defence, right? So irrespective of bombing, you need to eventually put boots on the ground, right? So some kind of invasion force has to be, working through, Luton or, working through, Mortlake, or working through all these different areas, and what's interesting here is that there's already a degree of, what's the term? Psychogeography is the term that people use, associated with, why is Arsenal different than West Ham? Like, why are the fans different for Arsenal than they are for West Ham? Well, this also represents, street fighting men, right? So what does street fighting men look like in these? So you get all this kind of beautiful tapestry stuff, which I think, is exciting a lot of different people when I talk to them about this project. So,
well, if you can get them role playing, which they might not have done before, then I think that's also good too. Huh?
Many different possibilities. So anyway, That's the pitch associated with the operation. It's currently Sim Sea Line is what I'm calling it, which mysteriously I was able to get quite comfortably. But nothing up currently because I'm getting the software to talk together and behave in a civilized fashion. I have owed people YouTube videos for quite some time associated with this. I recorded a couple of them, and I don't know. Third time's a charm.
Okay. Yeah. So I would finish up by saying that I will get you playing an online game. So be careful what you wish for there. There's some talk of something coming up. So I'm very excited about that.
Very definite. I like that.
Yes, absolutely.
Barney, it's been an absolute pleasure. I hear the world evolving around you. I hear glasses being shattered and various other noises, which would have gone back to the original plan was actually to record a fake podcast with you this morning.
Well, we can simulate a fake podcast at some point, yeah.
Most definitely.
Absolutely.
Anyway, I'll let you get to your evening.
But as always, we've only talked about a tiny bit of what we thought we'd talk about, so there's got to be a next time, hasn't there?
Well, it was part of the plan to get on your recording and do something similar. So
yeah, good.
I'll talk to you soon, Barney. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.